For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale. Last week, the sinking of a Russian missile cruiser, Moskva, has sent not only shockwaves amongst military strategists or even enthusiasts, but also shown the Russian military in poor light. Now, why has this happened? How has this happened? And is it now showing up the Russian military's poor preparedness or mishandling of the situation in Ukraine? Are all the questions that are being raised across the world. Today, to talk about this incident in particular, and of course, in general, about the military strategy or the naval strategy and tactics, I'm joined by Rear Admiral Sudarshan Srikhande, a well-known guest on StratNews Global as well as on my other website, bharatshakti.in, and a specialist in many of the tactics and strategies in naval warfare, as well as keeping a watch on strategic issues across the world. Welcome to this program, Admiral Srikhande. It's a shocking incident in many ways, right?
Yes, thank you. Yes, indeed, it is a surprising incident at one level that it happened. But I would say that at a fundamental level, such surprises have happened for a long, long time. Indeed, this is not the first, nor the second, nor the third such incident. In fact, there have been probably dozens of incidents like this, where tactically people have been surprised, and perhaps tactically, a particular navy has been underprepared, if not unprepared.
So in this case, because this was a flagship of the Russian fleet in Black Sea, would the Ukrainians have been searching for it or targeting it particularly, or do you think it's one of those lucky hits with the so-called Neptune missile is what everybody is talking about? What is your preliminary assessment based on whatever is available in public domain?
At this stage, it is probably very difficult to unravel what happened because both sides have been guarded in what I think they have put out. There is also an element of sort of fake news that has been coming about a lot of aspects about this. So I would say that from what is reasonably known at this stage is that the ship was attacked. It was probably attacked by anti-ship missiles, probably the Neptune. We do not know what all tactics the Ukrainian used, but as you mentioned, it seems certain that they have been tracking these ships, this fleet off the coast of Ukraine in the Black Sea and in the Black Sea as a whole. Certainly, the one thing that happens today with regularity is that in peacetime or with other partners, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, as we say, is something that nations can help other nations and yet not get complicitly involved. So we do not know what sort of assistance the Ukrainians had, but one imagines, that they had this assistance. And finally, to attack an adversary, you have to know where the adversary is and then figure out how best to do it. So I agree with you that the Ukrainians must have been tracking these ships. I mean, they were not operating very far from coastlines. The Black Sea is quite big, but in terms of ISR capabilities that can be brought in, it could the space could be relatively shrunk for higher intensity and persistence of watching where the ships are. That apart, I guess one hears from the media that the Ukrainians might have used drones, etc., to keep both the enemy under pressure and created a factor of surprise and distraction. I mean, you look at the principles of war from Chanakya to Sun Tzu to the modern principles of war, where, to use a more current term, surprise and security as principles of war remain absolutely relevant. So they might have used tactics to deceive Russian ships operating off the Ukrainian and the Black Sea coast, and lull them into a certain level of complacency, perhaps. On the other hand, from the Russian side also, initially there was denial. After that, there was an acceptance that, there was a fire, there was some damage, whether it was action damage or an internal explosion, was still quite hazy. And only I think yesterday they finally announced that the ship had sunk while proceeding to its base port in en route. So there could have been various factors. There is a small possibility that it could have been added by an underwater explosion that could have come from a torpedo or more likely from drifting mines. There have been reports of fishermen having, recovered drifting mines in their nets, including some Turkish fishermen. So who has let these mines drift along, which is of course not permitted under international law? We do not know, but it seems to me that as the war is intensifying, uh, uh, both sides will probably use greater and greater uh, tactical flexibility and surprise. But that said, uh, uh, it probably is an embarrassment for the
It
Russian
is.
Navy
It
to have
shows
to have
some
lost
degree.
lost a flagship like this, and it shows a certain level, as you mentioned, of perhaps lack of competence.
Absolutely. In fact, Sudarshan, as we are working on, and for our viewers' benefit, we are working on an article about analyzing the Russia-Ukraine conflict from its different aspects. In fact, the entire spectrum. And one of the things that one also is going to talk about in that article is about what is the new, if you can say, a predominant trend is capturing perceptions, is the new high ground of war and conflict these days. So we really don't know. There is a lot of fog of war here. Could the ship been hit by, say, a underwater explosion? Maybe a torpedo had hit the ship and not really the Neptune missile. All those speculations are going on in OSINT handles on Twitter and in other social media platforms. So there could be several possibilities, right? But the fact is, the Russian ship has sunk, which is a major embarrassment, as you mentioned.
Yes, of course. I would say, you mentioned about a lucky shot, uh, and that's quite possible. If we go by sort of how many missiles are required to sink a ship, then the numbers could be larger in terms of single shot. I'm just going here into a little naval technicality or a weapons technicality of
Please
single
do.
shot kill probability. But
Please do.
history is replete with examples of the lucky shot, whether it was HMS Hood in the battle against Bismarck, whether it were two of the battle cruisers in the Battle of Jutland, um, whether it was one single torpedo that hit the Belgrano, or sometimes it has taken more shots. I mean, one example where a relatively smaller destroyer, the Israeli destroyer Eilat, which sank actually 3 months after the Six-Day War. There is a
Hmm.
misperception that
In
she was sunk
67,
during the Six-Day War in
in
1967. That's right.
1967. That's right.
That's right. In 1967. So this happened at a time of sort of what I think the in Arabs and Israelis termed it as the war of attrition, which was after the 1967 Six-Day War, where a fair amount of skirmishes took place. And I think the Egyptians were extremely skillful in in creating deception, and from their missile boats launched three, if I remember right, three of the earliest class of anti-ship missiles that they had. And mind you, when we are talking about 1967, so our own induction of missile boats was still a few years into the future for
In
1971,
71.
and
Yeah.
that has been mentioned. So uh, it took that time. If I remember right, and pardon me if I am wrong, uh, it took, I think, three missile hits to sink Eilat, because they all sort of hit on the upper deck. But a lucky shot, with two missiles hitting or one smaller missile hitting, if it hits ammunition that has been primed and fused and kept ready for action on the upper decks, can set off secondary explosions. It can set
That's
off
right.
secondary fires, and it can create underwater damage that can create hull breaches and result in sinking. So there are several possibilities. Uh, rather than speculating that it was this weapon or that weapon. It shows us the complexity of
Naval war.
naval combat at the tactical level, and therefore the the degree of readiness, uh, attention, and alertness that is required 24/7 to avoid that 5 minutes of misery that can befall one's own ship, uh, from which there might not be recovery. So
Absolutely.
naval warfare is a lot of inaction and then suddenly a few minutes of mayhem and action.
Exactly. In fact, the Russians have somewhat indirectly admitted that there was an explosion in the ammunition storage, which again, confirms the possibility that you mentioned, that it could have been hit. The ammunition would have been ready on the upper deck also, or there could have been a lucky hit in the ammunition storage, several decks below, perhaps. So we don't know really. But the other thing that I wanted to bring in and seek your comments on is the Russian military's recent trend of being a showcase military, rather than being completely competent and very well trained military. The parades and the starched uniforms and the grand display for which the communist countries, erstwhile or otherwise, are known. Would that have played some part in the incompetence that is now very evident in this incident from on the Russian part?
I mean, that's always an interesting issue to think about. It could well be so. It could well be a contributor to a general sense of false assurance or bravado that 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 such issues bring up. I as a you've covered as a journalist, and as a book writer and as a historian of recent conflicts in some countries, what happens at the tactical level. And therefore, I mean, when I as a young officer was in the Soviet Union, under a very sort of communist environment, uh, initially I was also impressed with all the flags and all the parades that one could see live. And yet you realize that after some time, your mind stopped noticing those big slogans, big flags, etc., because they were always there. And your mind sort of shut them out as white noise. And I'm sure this happened to Russian citizens, or Soviet citizens at that time, to a greater extent. But so there is this danger, I would say, of putting it somewhere, that when symbolism overwhelms or trumps substance, uh, it is a problem. And I feel that especially in the last 10 years, uh, as a sort of detached anecdotal observer, of film clips of their parades, the increasingly complex band concerts, and commemorative events that have increased over time. uh, the drill has become more complex. The parades have become larger. Not only that, parades have been held in various cities, and various events are being commemorated. Now, of course, all armed forces do some parades. They are probably an important part of the civil military relationship, where the civilian population needs to see some of this. But there's always a danger of this being overdone. I would say that it was those very impressive sort of May Day parades and post World War II parades that used to come on newsreels, which impressed a lot of countries. And therefore, uh, even our parade sort of got patterned, perhaps on that, thinking this was one way of bringing the military might of a country, to the notice of millions and crores of citizens. But there could be a downside to it, because all such ceremonial events also come at a opportunity cost of the effort, time, and monies that are involved in that. And finally, I mean, I would say, and I think we've discussed this separately while talking about it, that uh, the only really the only place an armed forces have to perform is on the battlefield.
Battlefield,
Uh,
yeah, absolutely.
every other performance is much lower in priority. So this is where we need to be careful. And to that extent, we could probably look at uh, some of the militaries, uh, especially in, say, Western countries, which do a lot lesser of all this. Um, uh, and I think maybe 2 3 years ago or 4 years ago, I'm not very sure, but there was political driving going on in Washington for impressive parades, to which, if I remember right, the Pentagon was not at all keen to do that,
Right.
and they finally, did it in a very small measure, because all
Correct.
this comes at an opportunity cost. Uh, I'm not saying do away with all this. Some of it is required for the civil military understanding, but there's a danger in any country of doing this. Democracies have a mechanism by which some of these things get toned down, but in autocracies, uh,
Yes.
directives can go, which is what I believe could be happening in Russia. I'm not entirely sure whether this is a major contributory factor. That is difficult to say,
Yeah.
because
But it is
you
one of
can't,
it could be influenced, could have influenced one of those things. The other thing which is noticed by people who watch naval incidents or naval accidents or naval sinkings is the predictable pattern under which the ship was patrolling. It
yeah,
wasn't, in the Black Sea. So it became perhaps easy target. It became easier for the Ukrainians and their allies to pinpoint with some accuracy where the ship was and then target it. Again, it shows either the lack of initiative or innovation in the Russian military or the navy, and also laxness or laxity on part of the skipper of the ship itself, without being too judgmental. What would you think of these some of these opinions that have been given out in public domain?
yeah, I think there could be a lot going on for these opinions, that your again, deception, surprise, concentration of force, economy of effort, all have to be evaluated as things happen. There were signs, of course, that the Ukrainians had probably developed this missile some years back. Ukraine, after all, had a fair amount of defense technology base that they had. I mean, it's also there are analyses which show that the Ukrainian armed forces performance in 2014 or 18 was also not up to scratch in many ways, but they seem
Right.
to have learned lessons. They've
Hmm.
done badly there. The Russian, or the separatists in those Russian controlled areas or Russian
Yes.
influenced areas in Donbass, etc., also did quite well. So the picture is not one sided. That one side is showing all the skills and the other side is conspicuous by the proof of lack of skills, as sort of, if one could put it that way. But I would say that here, the predictability had to be decreased. They were operating far too close, and I just go back to uh, um, a line that has been, I think, wrongly attributed to Admiral Nelson, who cautioned that a ship cannot fight a fort. Uh, Now, in 200 years ago, it was true, because
The range.
castles had
Hmm.
had much bigger guns than had ships, and ships' guns could not be elevated to
Right.
attack, especially guns that were fitted on castles, which were fitted on higher ground, perhaps
Right.
forts, etc., on a hill.
Correct.
So, but nonetheless, what has happened in naval warfare are, I would say, two major trends. One is that there is a persistence of knowing where your adversary is likely to be. This clarity is not 100%, but it is far better than we can imagine, and it can be supplemented through space-based surveillance, through greater cyber operations, through greater electronic means, and of course through surveillance by maritime patrol aircraft, by drones, by high altitude drones, by the smaller drones, like the Turkish drones that Ukraine seems to be using. So there are a whole lot of options
Vectors.
available for greater battlefield transparency. There
That's
will be gaps in that transparency that can be exploited, but you can never be sure whether you are being watched or you are in a gap during that watch. So if you are operating in a small area going up and down, uh, you will sooner or later, the probability that you will be hit will keep increasing with time. And I
your
think the
foot leaves
Russians
the
could
house
have,
first. Yeah, your footprints are much more visible
That's right.
and are
That's
predictable to map,
yes,
really.
yes. And really, I would say that, having operated without sort of major incident now for 3-4 weeks, there might have been, as you said, some laxity uh, coming into the minds of a ship's crew itself.
That's right.
That the danger is not so real, uh,
Hmm.
and it is not so immediate. So there could be various factors. This only time will tell, or perhaps time will never tell. But
Never tell. We don't know.
but there are lessons for every navy and every armed force here.
I was going to come to that. Let's broaden the discussion a little bit. Let us look at how the Chinese Navy, which is being talked about the world over, how it is rapidly ramping up its assets, its capabilities, how it is now coming increasingly going sort of has longer legs than before. I'm sure the Chinese are, like all other militaries, are watching what's happening in Ukraine or in Black Sea in purely in naval terms. How would you think they would assess this? Because they also have what they call carrier killers, ships, anti-ship missiles, and they would really be salivating at this prospect if it is true that the Neptune has, sort of sunk the Russian flagship in Black Sea.
Yes, I mean, the fact that ordnance like anti-ship missiles can sink ships is now well known since 1967 at least, and
Yes.
several incidents after that, including merchant ships that were attacked by during the so-called tanker war between 1980 and 1988. So all
Hmm.
this is par for the course. It will continue. What is happening is the types of ordnance are changing. The lethality of the lethality of ordnance is changing because the accuracy of ordnance is improving. Uh, a lot of I've read some comments that it's only a 140 kilo warhead or it's a 200 kilo warhead, but it
Yes.
depends on where the 200 kilo or 140 kilo warhead, strikes. So it's just like a 5.56 bullet can do similar damage that a 7.62 caliber bullet can also
Exactly.
do, depending
True.
on where one or the other hits. So
Yes.
it's not a linear aspect like that. So certainly precision, lethality, speed, and accuracy are increasing in weapons. And you mentioned, the so-called carrier killers, which is actually a range of a more accurate ordnance that the Chinese are building, and other countries are also embarking on that. Uh, so it is to call it a carrier killer, of course, is a more catchy term, but it could equally strike larger ships of 8,000, 10,000 tons, or amphibious assault ships, or large merchant ships. uh,
Yes.
uh, the missile warhead doesn't really care, uh, so long as it homes on. So there is this danger now, or there is a greater need to develop greater defensive capabilities, greater tactical uh, uh,
Agility.
measures, which agility of the mind actually. So it would go back to what I sort of one of my favorites is what John Boyd said, that what matters is people, ideas, and things. So people and he said also that in that order. So things are the hardware we have, the hardware we will develop, but people and ideas, how we measure them, like you were mentioning, did they fall short tactically? So tactically you can fall short because of hardware, you can fall short about because of people whose training may not be up to scratch, and ideas that help all put all these things together. So
Sure.
I would say that specifically in the case of China, China would be learning those lessons, as should everybody else. Uh, and I would say that one of the things that sort of strikes me is that the Russians seem to have performed poorly at all levels, across all dimensions. The strategic level of warfare, the operational level of warfare, and the tactical level of warfare. And you mentioned some time back, the war of perception, and that's a very important point that you made, because uh, even the war of perceptions, Ukraine seems to be managing much better. Of course, one of the problems is these days, you know, uh, uh, one just doesn't know what is fake and what is not fake. To that extent, it has happened. There is some now increasing clarity, but this creates its own problems, because how do you make your own people believe anything at all? So
Yeah.
there has to be some clarity. But internally for the armed forces, I mean, the armed forces cannot live on fake news. Neither can armed forces, plan their next operation based on anything but real time assessment of intelligence of the enemy. And here a larger point I would like to sort of think about. I don't know whether there have been issues of cognitive biases about the enemy. What if one side feels, oh, the leader of the other side is quite literally a joker
Right.
because he was a comedian. Now,
Yes.
such cognitive biases can be very dangerous, of underestimating the enemy or
Yeah.
typecasting the enemy, as somebody inherently incapable of fighting or inherently incapable of bravery or, even tactical wisdom. So uh, the weak often win. Uh,
Yeah.
that's been
Yes.
that's been
So
one
they
of
have
the
more
inferences
determination.
we talk from
They have
warfare.
more determination. Yeah, they have more determination. But that apart, just two final thoughts on this. One is, of course, the U.S. Has the largest naval forces in history. How would U.S. look at all this? Because their contest in the Pacific against the Chinese is based on their naval might. So, what would US be looking at? I mean, would they be looking at honing their tactics or tweaking their tactics on sea, or they would be looking at the Chinese developments? How would they react to this?
Again, I would say that uh, the Ukraine war or no war, even if this had not happened, even if Slava had not been attacked by missiles or sunk, I would say that in the United States, a whole lot of thinking is going on about precisely this problem, which they term, overcoming A2AD, Chinese A2AD, and they've been
Absolutely.
discussing this for years. There are
Correct.
of course, mixed inferences they are drawing. Part of the inferences come from, the sort of the problems of admitting vulnerabilities of carriers,
Mhm.
because we get into a pro-carrier versus anti-carrier, lobbies in the United States. But that's not a helpful start point for this. And I would say that much of the American discourse now, in fact, now, for I would say for the past 3 or 4 years, has analyzed this as a very real threat, something that cannot be wished away because you love something about this, or that you cannot any longer afford to say no, carriers are not vulnerable, carriers are it, or something like that. Or it does not even mean that everything has to be replaced by submarines, but you have to create diverse capabilities and figure out. I mean, the challenges really are, how do you use the hardware you have better and better in the challenges that are coming up tomorrow and day after. You cannot wish your hardware away. You cannot create newer type of hardware overnight. And that's a challenge for even a larger navy, as you said, the US as the US Navy as the largest navy, but they are also looking at multi-dimensional warfare, where the Marines, Army, Space, and Cyber come together. And I think in this case, they are probably taking a leaf from the entire A2AD, which is multi-dimensional, as far as the Chinese have built. And I would say that the Chinese are uh, far advanced on the multi-dimensional operations. The Chinese would also, I think, one of the more important lessons that could be that all armed forces, not only that, political leadership should be thinking of, is how to create an environment where armed forces are under pressure to perform potentially in the conflict that is about to come or may come, and it can come with a suddenness. How do
Absolutely.
we prepare for that? And for that, I think they need the tools, they need the you know they need the authority to do what they need to do without pressures of distraction that can be created from outside the armed forces system. Uh, and and for even for political leadership of any country, whether democratic or authoritarian, uh, losing in a conflict is politically quite disadvantageous. In all this, I
Imprudent.
think finally I would like to just say that armed forces should never lose sight of the political objectives, but that also means that the political leadership should be able to formulate and convey the political objectives for which, militaries have to perform at the strategic, operational, and tactical levels of warfare. Only then can something positive from that country's point of view. I'm not making a moral judgment on this.
True.
But positive, politically positive from that country's point of view, which might be disadvantageous or quite a tragedy for the loser.
Absolutely. No, but so that means, the prerequisite for all this between political leaders and military leaders is a clarity of communication and a very honest dialogue about what needs to be achieved. But one final question and a thought. In India, we have been again going through the debate that you mentioned about carrier or no carrier. And the late General Bipin Rawat was known as somebody who was a skeptic about obtaining or procuring a third aircraft carrier for Indian Navy. This should reignite again that debate, I suppose, which was put on the back burner. We are not sitting on judgment here, but there will be a lot of, I'm sure, analysis done in the Indian Naval Headquarters and navies around the world. So, your final thoughts on that before we close?
Yeah, I would say that we all have to learn lessons. Again, we don't need the Slava incident to point out what has been discussed for a long time. It has, nations need the armed forces that might perform better and better in future conditions. And some of that will have to come from how we use the past better. So India is, I think, in a good position. We have two carriers. Again, any weapon system, any platform, any weapon system works that much the better, when the opposition is that much the weaker. But what Slava shows and what all sort of wargaming shows, especially on the American side, is that a lot of ordnance can get through to say aircraft carriers. They've gamed it enough. But again, there are cultural challenges, what the Americans call tribal challenges of the carrier tribes versus the anti-carrier tribe or something. But I don't think we need to get into an internecine warfare within any navy on this, or within any armed forces. We need a navy or an army or an air force that we need, not one, I would say, that we love or we are comfortable with. That is where we need to go. There's nothing romantic about war. There's nothing romantic about platforms. They are weapons of war, and they ought to be made to perform what we have. And therefore, I think leadership and training and continuous combat training are required, and some of the other peripherals that navies and armies or air forces might be doing ought to be. We need to throttle back. All armed forces need to throttle back on this.
Very well put. I think as a final thought, let me end this conversation on this note. We don't know enough to analyze the incident of sinking of the Russian ship so far. I'm sure there will be occasion in the future, not too distant a future, on analyzing this. But certain early lessons from this incident in terms of tactics, in terms of the weapons platforms, and the effectiveness or even the luck one armed force or the other armed forces or the others need, whichever military is in combat. Thank you very much for your thoughts, Admiral Srikhande. We will come back to you when we have an occasion, but this is precious, and I'm sure our viewers will really benefit from your insights on naval tactics and naval strategies, and your thoughts on what may have gone wrong or what may have happened in the Black Sea. For the moment, it's thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. As always, a pleasure. Thank you, Nitin.
Thank you. So viewers, as we always promise you, this is something that we specialize in. We try and bring you a different perspective each time. So do keep watching StratNews Global. Do keep spreading the word for subscription to our YouTube channel. And of course, keep sending feedback and comments. We welcome them. We base our programs on many of these suggestions and comments that come in. But for the moment, it's goodbye from me, Nitin Gokhale.
For the right to our YouTube channel, click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amita Bravi, and on Talking Point, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank each and every one of our YouTube subscribers who've taken us to that 100,000 mark that we are looking at. We thank you for your support and your engagement. Our experts today join us from New York. Professor Rajan Menon, he's the director of the Grand Strategy Program at Defense Priorities. He's a Spitzer Emeritus Professor of International Relations at the City College of New York. He's also a senior research fellow at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. And he's also a co-author of a book he wrote in 2015, Ukrainian Conflict, The Unwinding of the Post-Cold War Order. Professor Menon, thank you for giving us time so early in the morning.
Hello, Amitabh. How are you?
Great. Other guest joins us from Washington. Richard Rosso has been on StratNews Global before, senior fellow and Wadhwani chair in U.S.-India policy studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Rosso, I believe you were up and early going for a jog around the White House, so you can't blame me for waking you.
Beautiful morning for it.
Professor Menon, I know we just get into the implications of sanctions and your views on that, but before, even though it is probably already too late in terms of U.S.-Russia relations, but you've been writing about it since at least 2015, if not earlier, about the need to recognize Russia's security concerns and how this could have been avoided. If you want to just expand on that a little bit.
So the debate here, excuse me, is about two things. What role did NATO expansion play? And whether NATO expansion is at all important, and whether this is all about Mr. Putin's fear of a democratic Ukraine. And I think it's a combination of both. But I think there's no doubt that NATO expansion contributed to this. The Russian leadership has been opposed to this from the beginning of NATO expansion as a concept to 1999 when it began, and certainly since President Putin became president in 2000. It's true that the NATO alliance had no immediate plans to admit Ukraine, but I think there was a Russian fear. Now, that said, I don't think that justifies a full-on assault against a sovereign country, but the context for this is certainly NATO expansion in part.
Mr. Rosso, President Zelensky has said he's cold, Ukraine is cold towards NATO. NATO, of course, that whole process would take a lot longer. The EU is maybe another question. But is there anything, as the Americans say, in the current situation, off-ramps? Or are we going to see this death and destruction, at least in the short term?
Lots of potential off-ramps, but I think it's anybody's guess. I think the best experts that I know on Russia, the days leading up, most of them, I think, would have assumed that there wouldn't be the invasion itself. So when we talk about off-ramps, still a lot of guesswork, but we know what they would probably look like. A ceasefire, Russia controlling parts of the country, backing off of others, Russia leveling the country and trying to stand over the ruins, something happening in Moscow where Putin is dislodged because of unhappiness. So lots of potential ways that this could play out. But I think as we saw with people's expectations that there would not be the invasion, which I think was widely held, I don't know that we all know exactly what's in President Putin's mind right now.
Professor Menon, now the unprecedented severity of sanctions and the unprecedented nature of US, West, NATO, EU, Japan, Australia, other countries like Singapore, in terms of imposing those sanctions or costs on Russia. One, the impact for the Russians itself, because President Putin would have probably gamed them already. And two, the domestic blowback in terms of either politics or economics, whether it's for President Biden or any other country for that matter.
So before I answer that, just very quickly, I don't see any off-ramps at all at this point. I think the Russians are determined to push this campaign forward. This morning, we woke up to the news that they've expanded military operations, at least airstrikes, to two cities, one Lutsk, not far from the Polish border in the northwest, and the other Ivano-Frankivsk, and that's probably a preemptive move to try to seal off parts of Western Ukraine to prevent arms shipments from Poland. Now, on the economic sanctions, they have been severe. There are shortages. The ruble has tumbled. There are foreign currency restrictions about money that can leave the country. Prices have increased. But so far, there is no sign that although the average Russian has been hurt significantly, and the Russians cannot prop up the ruble because about 50% of the Russian central bank's reserves in dollars are outside the country and blocked, there's no sense that despite some sporadic demonstrations that the government has come up against yet a protest movement that it cannot block. It has substantial coercive powers at its disposal. I've no doubt that it will use it if need be. I don't see any sign that Putin, despite the sanctions, is looking for a way out of this.
Right. Mr. Rosso, if you want to take the same question in terms of both the repercussions in Russia, which we haven't seen much of, but more so in the US with the midterm elections coming up, with possibility of the House and the Senate moving across, and in each country having their issues.
Well, clearly, I think when you see the Biden administration moving even further and looking at impacting Russia's oil and gas sectors, they picked up the signals that across the United States, there's generally support for intervening, at least through sanctions, as well as indirect military support in the conflict in Ukraine. It would have been very difficult with midterms coming up for any democratically elected leader trying to retain office and have some level of authority to take steps on energy. They're going to increase prices at the pump for most Americans. So it seems that trying to assist Ukraine in this effort has been building up widespread support, but certainly the moral reasons behind it are very strong and powerful. And the administration was hoping from the get-go. I think a lot of us weren't quite sure that the Western reaction would be quite as strong and concerted as it has been. And so I think so far, you do see, and probably to Putin's surprise to some extent, that it has galvanized pushback from a lot of countries that hadn't been seeing eye to eye in recent years. So that might have been a bit of a miscalculation, I think, on Russia's side here. But I agree that so far you're not really seeing much interest in breaking, though.
Amitabh, can I add a word quickly on sanctions? We know
Please.
a lot about the history of sanctions, and to summarize the literature, it is as follows: sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. But when a country has priced in some of the consequences and is determined to pursue an action that, for whatever reason, it deems extremely important, it will undergo substantial pain. So the idea that states are just economic calculators like accountants with green eye shades, I think misses the point that they fight or operate for all kinds of other reasons: insecurity, prestige, status, and so on. So the record of sanctions working here is mixed. The problem is that even if they work, it will not save Ukraine from what is now becoming a scaled up, highly punitive war. 2 million refugees have left the country, 800,000 displaced, about $900 million in assets destroyed so far. It will take Ukraine a very long time to come out from under this. What I don't understand is what Mr. Putin's endgame is here.
Mr. Rosso, if you want to talk about blowback in terms of how long can the impact, which is impacting the countries that are imposing these sanctions, for example, $4 a gallon for gas in the US, how long can that price be paid, and especially politically, if, like I said, there will be elections, midterm elections coming up?
Well, doing it so close, I think when we're talking just 6 months ahead of the midterm elections, it does feel like they've already taken into consideration the midterm elections, knowing that there's going to be, even if oil prices come down, even if gas prices at the pump come down by then, there's going to be that reminder and shock that this intervention, really did to some extent contribute to that. And whether the Biden administration decides to reopen some of the areas of the United States that we'd held off on our own exploration and development kind of remains to be seen. But, as we've seen in past conflicts, the American public can hold attention for a certain period of time and not too much longer. And so I suspect, we've kind of got a calculated the political calculation through the midterms. But after that, it's difficult to imagine, taking these kind of steps that that would continue oil prices at a high level for much beyond that, I would think.
Professor Menon, do you want to take that?
Yes, I agree with Richard, but it goes well beyond oil. So Ukraine and Russia account for about 25% of all wheat exports. Ukraine is a major exporter of corn. Those prices have soared. Container shipping rates and shipping rates for tankers or fuel tankers have gone up substantially. Those costs will be passed on to the consumer. Metal prices have gone up. This will have an effect on Western growth rates. Already yesterday, Goldman Sachs downgraded its growth projections for the EU. It's expected to push inflation up here. Richard will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think our inflation rate now is the highest it's been in some decades. And so the question is, as the midterms come around, will the American public say, well, this is all Putin's fault, or will it at some point hold the government accountable? The Republicans, I'm sure, will do everything possible at some point to say that this is mismanagement by the Biden administration. Will the war end by then? I don't know.
I just want to go to your assessment, Mr. Russo, of the impact on India's economy. And I've seen a few shows that you've been doing of late, looking at the overall picture coming out of COVID, recovery of sorts, and now this. What's your overall economic impact assessment on the Indian economy, Mr. Russo?
Well, the Indian economy is still very sensitive to the price of oil, a little bit less to the price of other metals and commodities. But, it's true that as prices of all things begin to rise, as manufacturing costs begin to go up, India's going to feel the pinch. India already has a massive import bill, which triggers a lot of policy making from Delhi, trying to, local source a lot of things that the country imports. Oil, that's been so far very difficult to do, even with dramatic expansion in the amount of acreage under exploration in India. So I see mostly downside, but there are some, potential bright spots. For instance, you have seen Eastern Europe be one of the competing markets against India for things like IT services. And, because of instability in Europe, you may see some of that work come back to India in a little bit bigger way. So could be some potential small bright spots, but I see more downside risk, at least in the near midterm.
Professor Menon, your assessment?
Well, I'm not an expert on India like Richard is, but there's one thing that bears watching, and that is when India takes delivery of the S-400, which is a very sophisticated Russian air defense system, will it trigger the CAATSA sanctions? I don't know whether it will or not, but people are certainly raising that issue here. One could argue that Modi's India is seen as a kind of a budding strategic partner. On the other hand, India abstained from the resolution. It is a very significant military purchaser of Russian equipment, and I don't know how this will play out. So far as I know, CAATSA hasn't been raised and put on the front burner because there are too many other things going on, but it's something to keep your eye on.
Absolutely. I'll just get both your thoughts on that a little bit more and India-specific questions. But I just want to take in one of our regular viewers, an American who's in Australia, a professor, a writer, an author. He's come on our shows before, Salvador Barbones, and thanks for the Australian $10 question there. Professor Menon, is there a nuclear danger in destabilizing Russia through perhaps too effective economic sanctions, is what he asks?
I don't think the economic sanctions will destabilize Putin's government based on what I know now. Now, it's worth repeating here what Richard said at the outset. Nobody expected this war, and this has been a war of surprises. But what worries me here is there are some people who have called for regime change. Now, trying to attempt that in the world's only other nuclear superpower strikes me as a big gamble unless you are absolutely certain that one of two things will occur: a stable authoritarian successor to Putin who withdraws from Ukraine, or a democratic Russia. You have to be able to rule out the third option, which is violence and fragmentation in Russia. So I think this is a very dangerous policy advocacy. The Biden administration has said that it does not support it, but there are people here calling for it.
If you want to take that, Mr. Rossan, also just want to put in some other, it wasn't just oil, both of you mentioned that. I mean, there's talk of famine because of wheat in Africa. Another question which comes in from Rishikiran Devjyoti: what will happen to high-tech industries in the US after Russia bans titanium and other rare metals, Mr. Rosso?
Well, already just because of China's ability to dominate flows of precious metals that are used for technology and other things, there's been an aggressive push driven to some extent by government and, of course, a large extent by private sector to look for new sources of metals. I think that'll be expedited. So you may see a near short-term pinch, but there are deposits, and so it is possible to go to other places, but it's going to take time. You've got to make sure that you're accommodating any concerns about ecological damage in places where you're going to find additional resources. You've got to make sure that there's infrastructure to be able to get it to ports for shipping and transportation networks and things. But much of that process has already begun for a very different reason, of course, the concerns about China's ability to dominate the trade of certain precious metals and such. So I think this will really kind of double down and augment everybody's interest in making sure that happens.
Professor Menon, you mentioned CATSA, and I'll get your thoughts a little bit more, flesh them out from both of you. But how do you see India's legacy dependency on Russian arms and military supplies, especially in light of what's happening vis-a-vis China? Where do you go? I mean, I've read Dhruv Jaishankar writing recently that it's India's 1991 economic moment in the military terms, in terms of pivoting away.
So just before I answer that very quickly, in addition to the increase in prices of a lot of things, from metals to wheat to energy, there has also been a further disruption of the global supply chains, which were already made bad by the pandemic. Now, on the Indian-Russian arms relationship, two things. The Indian arms market is open to international competition in a way that it has not been in my memory. The Russians, the Soviets / the Russians had a lock on it. Now, because the Indian force structure is still composed of either imported Russian Soviet equipment or equipment made under license, this cannot happen very quickly. And I think one of the reasons why India has treaded lightly on the Russia-Ukraine war and not jumped in to condemn Russia is that there is a lot at stake for the Indian government. You do have Western armament companies, Israeli armament companies operating in the Indian market and eyeing it as a potential market. But there's a legacy problem with Russian equipment that cannot be overcome quickly.
I just wanted to go back to the CATSA question, Mr. Rosso. There were indications coming out of the administration, at least, that the Biden administration understood the position that India was in. And with China being the bigger threat for countries around the world, there would probably be a waiver. But then there is Congress, and then there is the invasion. Do you see anything changing in Washington because of what's been happening?
Yeah, it's a cloudy situation at best. I think before the invasion, I think we had a narrow pathway that seemed more likely than not that a waiver would be granted. But now, there is a disappointment in large sectors of the U.S. security establishment that would like to see India. They talk about, shared values and democracy, things like that, and they would like to see India take a harder position. I think those that are in the trenches, that are working day and night to try to create a stronger defense posture vis-a-vis the dangerous elements of the rise of China, that's the group that's willing to give a little bit more leeway for India on this and would look for a pathway through. There is, of course, a waiver authority that's included in the legislation. It's very narrow, and it's got language on things like, is the country supporting America's security interests globally? And those are the areas that I think have pinched a little bit more sharply closed because of this invasion and because of the perception that India hasn't really taken a stronger stance. India is in a campaign here, certainly the Indian government, to try to sell its own message more broadly in Washington. Whether that'll resonate is tough to see because we are just probably a few months away from when India will have the S-400s deployed and testing, and that was the trigger point for Turkey. So it looks like we're just a few months away from decision time. So this invasion, in that sense, couldn't have happened at a worse time.
Well, one squadron has been deployed, I believe, in Punjab. You're right that the rest of the four. But then what happens if the S-500s that India goes in for, and what happens to the SSN, the nuclear submarine? Just want to get, Professor, your comments on, again, what Salvatore is saying. I don't see why India should stop buying Russian arms until Europe stops buying Russian gas. Money is money. It doesn't matter what source it comes from.
Well, he has a point. I mean, the idea that countries that have very significant national interests and entanglements with Russia should be heedless to the national security implications of throwing all that overboard and line up with the Western position on Ukraine, I think is a bit much. It's not only India, by the way. So another country that the United States is even closer to, Israel, while it voted for the General Assembly resolution, has been walking a very fine line. Indonesia, Bangladesh, South Africa. So if you look, China, if you look at it in population terms, a very significant section of humanity has chosen not to really line up in the way that the United States would like. On the question of CATSA, I think there will be a debate in the corridors of power in Washington about the short term, whether to punish India in the short term versus what the long-term effect will be. And the question is whether the strategic thinkers who argue that we should play in the US the long game, win out, will decide what happens.
Right. Just getting in some more questions as they come in for both our panelists. In terms of the Russia-China relationship, Mr. Rosso, how do you see what's happening? Russia being pushed into China's corner even more reliant, whether it's politically, economically, diplomatically, maybe even militarily. How do you see that panning out in terms of the larger Indo-Pacific issue of containing China, the Quad?
Well, I think it has generated, renewed interest and concern about this topic, which had kind of been hanging on the sidelines in Washington for quite some time. I think those that look at it as kind of a near-term condominium, a partnership of aligned interest, which is fighting against a structure for security in the region that neither country really kind of has bought into. At the same time, when you look at it more longer term, and some, I would say it's certainly the minority in Washington, but some do think longer term, and there's likely to be more serious divisions and splits between those two as time goes on. It may be decades away, but it's unlikely to see that either country is going to look at the other as its superior, and what can the two possibly work on together that would effectively suit both interests. So short-term increased concern, long-term still wondering how long can the relationship last when it's based on a foundation simply of fighting the rest of the world.
Professor Menon, if you want to talk about that, and then I'll take another question that a viewer had for you.
Just to go back to Professor Barbonis's observation about, well, Europe should stop buying gas if India is expected to not take delivery of the S-400. He's right, except for one thing. There is no equivalent of CATSA that applies to European energy exports.
Gas.
Right, yes. So there's a legislative problem here that has to be overcome in terms of CATSA. Can India get a waiver or not? And I just don't know enough about this to tell you what will happen. And I'm not sure that anybody can predict. So there is some similarity between the European gas imports and the S-400, but CATSA is the thing that makes it complicated and different.
Sure. This is a question, again, I'm addressing to you, Professor Menon Rishikaran Devjyoti. Is the US willing to provide cutting-edge military hardware to India to wean off India from Russian equipment? The US has been reluctant to do so in the past. There's also, of course, India's import restrictions and the Make in India initiative. So how does all that come together?
My impression about the conversation about India in Washington is that it's less about the narrow goal of weaning India away from Russia, although there are people who would like to do that. It's much more the view that India is a large emerging power that can, for its reasons of its own self-interest, form some kind of a coalition with the United States to balance the country that's the real pure competitor. It's not Russia, but China. So the Russia thing, reducing India's reliance on Russia, is an important consideration, but for the strategic thinkers down the line, the eye is on China and the role that India can play there.
One for you, Mr. Rosso, from Omkar Dadpe. Can other nations, China, India, Turkey, compensate Russia's loss of the European oil market? There's some reports suggesting that a heavily discounted price has been offered to countries like India.
Well, India so far, I think, is at least on oil, has really been comfortable. I shouldn't say comfortable, it's an overstatement, but they have accommodated the United States and others' interest in drawing down oil imports from Iran and Venezuela. So oil you've seen just because there are other markets that and not quite the same historical, et cetera, that India has been willing, to bend the pressure that we've seen in hydrocarbons in the past. The question is, is the United States going to try to offer itself up as the next best provider as well? Because which has been across the range of hydrocarbons, gas, oil, as well as coal. Then that starts to look a little bit self-interested. Uncle Sam, basically trying to force India's hand to draw down buying from Russia in exchange for buying from the United States. So I'd be a little bit concerned about that. But other countries, China in particular, may care a whole lot less about what the world thinks and if they can find prices that are accommodating. But the question is, how do they get it there? The routes may not be quite so easy.
Professor Menon, again, your assessment of if this goes on for a while longer, and it doesn't seem like there's any off-ramp, as you said, though Mr. Rosso thought there were many. The impact on India's economy in terms of when you're talking about sanctions being imposed on Russia, whatever we get from them in large quantities, apart from military hardware, of course.
Yeah, I'm going to kick this question to Richard because I'm not an expert on India, so I'm loath to talk about this.
Sure, Mr. Rosso.
Well, so overall, I think that the world has been looking for additional markets. You do see overall a big change in where trade flows are kind of moving to right now. India is hoping to get a larger share of production, manufacturing. You see some drawdown from China, for instance, and some of that initially has went to Vietnam, to Malaysia. But even on defense equipment, you see India recently, the Ministry of Defense, looking to insource production of a lot of defense material that otherwise they were looking to buy from outside. The production-linked incentive schemes. So I think you see a lot of drivers right now for India to further kind of insulate itself against international economic wobbliness by producing not just defense material, which has always kind of been there, but on energy with the attempts to develop more self-sufficiency through renewable energy and such. So there's a lot of steps that are going on right now, I think, to insulate that, if they've been started a bit earlier, would offer a bit more protection. But I think better late than never. But then, of course, you do, with some of India's own trade restrictions that have come up, you do see some pressure from the United States and other markets as well to draw that down. So a lot of conflicting things right now in terms of how the linkages are going to impact the Indian economy, I think, in a significant way.
Professor Menon, as you pointed out, if Vladimir Putin has an objective, he would have known, maybe not, known the entire gamut of sanctions that he would be facing, but the alternatives that they have in terms of either SWIFT or what I'm asking is, how long can the Russian economy be badly hit? Like Salvatore thinks, actually, the damage is being underestimated of the Russian economy.
Right. So a couple of things. The Russian banking system in its entirety has not been cut off from SWIFT. What has happened is that 7 banks have been cut off from SWIFT. And the energy sector, because of European pleading, has not been cut off. As you know, Europe gets about 40% of its gas from Russia. But what a lot of people don't know is that Russia is also the largest oil supplier. It's very difficult for the Europeans to come up with an alternative because we're talking in total about between 180 to 200 billion cubic meters of gas. That's a lot. There isn't enough spare supply in the market to suddenly divert supplies to fill that gap in Europe, not from the United States, not from any producer of natural gas. The Europeans have to be very careful. Now, it is said that as the weather warms up, they will need to import less. That's true, but whatever they import, they will still need.
Sure. Just again, while we are on the topic of India, Professor Menon, if you want to share on the rupee-ruble agreement, the arrangement, so to speak, I mean, can that be used to circumvent the sanctions? And if that does really happen, then what is the political or geopolitical fallout that India may face?
So Russia has some workarounds. It's relied to some degree on the Chinese equivalent of SWIFT. It's called CIPS, the Chinese response to SWIFT. With the BRICS countries, it has tried to move toward de-dollarization in trade. But insofar as trade with Japan, South Korea, Western Europe, and the United States is concerned, the hit will be very heavy. This morning, there is discussion in the United States about raising tariffs on Russian imports to punish it even further. So there's no question that the economic squeeze on Russia is going to be very, very tough and could get tougher. The question, though, is what is the purpose? If the purpose is to end the war and to have Vladimir Putin withdraw his troops from Russia, I'm very skeptical that that will happen.
Right. Excuse me, Mr. Ross, I just wanted to get a quick comment. Of course, it's been happening for a long time in terms of India's trade deals, whether it was with the UAE, which we recently signed, UK, Israel, EU, Canada, Australia. Can that kind of, ameliorate any overall damage that the Indian economy faces?
I don't think so. They're still moving along relatively slowly. You did see the announcement of the conclusion of the UAE Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, but I don't think the UAE is going to come in and fill the gaps necessarily that India would face, because of at various market conditions. You look at some of the other markets where India is talking to regularly right now about concluding long pending agreements, Europe, the UK, Canada, Australia, and they still have quite a distance to go. So I don't think any of these are poised and close enough to be stopgap fillers to offset any economic damage that might happen because of global instability and minerals and oil and such. So long-term play is certainly good. Short-term, I don't think you're going to see any real impact on the Indian economy.
Professor Menon, if you want to wrap up, you started off by saying you don't know what Vladimir Putin's endgame is, but it doesn't look very good for Ukraine as we know it.
No, very quickly, the situation on the ground now is they have another northern city, Chernihiv, under siege. They're moving at least airstrikes to Lutsk in the west and Ivano-Frankivsk, sort of not quite that far west, but west enough, shall we say. And then they've made huge gains on the Black Sea coast. I think they are trying to make Ukraine a landlocked country. Finally, there are big Ukrainian forces east of a city called Dnipro, which is in the south central. Between Dnipro and Donbass, the objective is to encircle and destroy that army. If they succeed, that will be a very big blow for the Ukrainians. Ultimately, the logic of the balance of power and the substantial might that the Russians wield will force some kind of agreement upon the Ukrainians, assuming that some political upheaval does not occur in Russia. The question is, what is the price that will be paid by the Ukrainians to achieve, to prevent further destruction? And what are they prepared to do? And what can President Zelensky do given his domestic political constraints?
Mr. Rousseau, your last thoughts in the price that not only Ukraine and Russia are going to pay, but the rest of the world, and if you want to talk about India and the US.
Well, we do have a couple of important bilaterals or multilaterals that are coming up. We should have the U.S.-India 2+2 dialogue that brings together our defense and foreign ministries. And then hopefully not long after that, maybe April or May, we'll have a Quad Leaders Summit that's expected to take place in Japan. So both between these countries trying to balance the Pacific threats that we look at, but also accommodating, giving India a little bit more space in its relationship with Russia. Having these kind of senior level meetings, I think, is going to be pretty important because, as Dr. Menon rightly pointed out, the CAATSA waiver decision is the single most significant thing on the table for the coming months. That's going to determine at least the next handful of years in the trajectory of U.S.-India defense and security relations. So it's good that we got these things teed up well ahead of time. They're on track to take place, and that gives leaders an opportunity to kind of sharpen thinking and make sure that we don't take any missteps that are going to be more damaging for regional security in the long term.
Mr. Rousseau, I absolutely appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you for coming on StratNews Global.
Yeah.
And Professor Menon, thank you for waking up early and sharing your expertise and your experience here. Again, it was a pleasure as usual.
Thank you, Amitabh. It's always good to talk to you.
And to all our viewers there, each one of you who have helped us get towards that 100,000 subscriber mark, we are hoping to go much further. This is The Talking Point on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Brevi.
Hello and welcome to The Gist on StratNews Global. Good evening. I'm Surya Gangadharan, and our focus is on Ukraine. Let me give you a quick recap of the developments so far. I have a small graphic coming up for you. Russia has attacked key Ukrainian cities, Kharkiv, Kiev, and Lviv. Missiles have been used to neutralize military and air bases. That's what the Russians are saying. Russia also says no civilian populations will be targeted. And there's been condemnation from Europe and, of course, the US. I have with me from Vienna, Velina Chakarova. She's director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. She's been on our channel before. Welcome, Velina. Glad to have you. How long do you expect these operations to continue, and what exactly does President Putin intend to achieve?
Well, first, it's really hard to tell how long this military operation will last, given the the quickly developing situation on the ground. Let me first stress that military attack, a reinvasion of Ukraine by Russia has been anticipated since the last 2 months. The unprecedented military escalation along the Ukrainian border, placing 75% of the armed forces of Russia, more than 190,000 troops along the borders, but also meanwhile in Belarus was indicative of the intentions by the Russian president. And since this morning, European Central Time, Russian president made it very clear that it's going to be a military operation in eastern Ukraine, specifically focusing on the two regions, Donetsk and Lugansk. But what we are actually observing is a full-scale military attack at the moment. So obviously, the intentions may change over the course of the military operation. What is clear, so basically what are the goals? First, of course, subjugation of the Ukrainian state, political elite, and basically that would mean a clear violation of all international law norms, specifically when it comes to the territorial integrity of the country. It's a casus belli since this morning, European time. Second, the goal of Putin is for Ukraine to never ever enter, that means join the North Atlantic Alliance, NATO, but also probably there will be a push for an official recognition of a neutrality status. The complete demilitarization of the country is also on the agenda. And finally, so basically, also in addition to that, there will be an official, announced by Ukraine that Crimea is part of Russia. And of course, in the longer run, the two regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, will likely be annexed by Russia as well.
Mm-hmm. And all this while NATO has anticipated this and has done nothing.
Well, in fact, it was obvious right from the start that there will be no military involvement or participation by NATO members or by any European member states. This was very clear right from the start, and even today the Secretary General of NATO confirmed once again that NATO is not going to get militarily involved, NATO members. However, there will be military support. There will be military assistance to Ukraine. Ukraine is currently fighting back and will not surrender without a fight. And I suppose that this defense assistance is going to continue. And next to it, there will be and additionally, there will be troops deployment by NATO member states along the eastern flank, which borders Ukraine and is basically the line, the borderline, so to say, between NATO members and the Russian Federation.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe the Ukrainians overplayed their hand?
Well, in fact, it is absolutely clear that this was a blatant military attack by Russia, and it was unprovoked military reinvasion. Ukraine has been in a situation of undeclared war with Russia since 2014. Since then, more than 14,000 people fell victim to the insurgency and tensions, military tensions in eastern Ukraine, in these two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. And in a sense, in this particular situation, Ukraine is the victim of a military aggression in a very unprovoked manner.
Mm-hmm. You know, there is an argument which I've been hearing that this situation suits the Americans and it suits the Russians, because Russia has now got Ukraine under some kind of control, and they've diffused the challenge they were facing. The Americans have got Europe solidly behind them, and therefore they can now focus on, they've managed to isolate Russia, so they can now focus on the Indo-Pacific, on China. Does this make sense?
There is also a counter argument that I would like to present, and that is that first and foremost, Biden made it very clear that United States will not get militarily involved. There will be midterms elections on November 8th this year, and it's very important election for the Democrats to not lose places to the Republicans, given that in 2 years there will be a presidential election once again. And in a sense, some of the statements of the American president were a kind of a door opener for aggressive actions by Russia. Then again, of course, we can argue that in the long run, probably the reading of the Russian president is correct, unfortunately, and that is that there is going to be an American retreat from the old continent, given that the systemic competition with China is going to take place predominantly in the Indo-Pacific realm. And of course, given these circumstances, were also the very specific position of Russia, and that was not only about United States but also about China. So on the one hand, Russia presented its red line, and that is sphere influence in Eastern Europe, the possibility to decide over the fate of other sovereign states when it comes to Russian security interests and also geopolitical interests. And basically this red line, these were the almost impossible conditions by Russia, which were presented to United States and NATO. Of course, the expectation was that they would have never been negotiated. But on the other hand, at the very same time, because we need to put it into a geopolitical context, there was also this unprecedented approximation with China. The joint declaration from February 4th, the diplomatic boost when the Russian president went for the opening of the Olympic Games, and the very fact that actually Putin waited until the Olympic Games were over on February 20. And if you look at the time frame when the military operation was launched, it makes sense that there was also a kind of unwritten settlement also with China to provide diplomatic boost for the Olympic Games, given the isolation by the most of the European countries and also by the United States during the Olympics. And then again, of course, knowing that China will diplomatically back Russia's position, which we are already observing. It was a very weak diplomatic statement by the Chinese MFA today, basically even dismissing the idea of invasion, whereas, as I stated, this is not even an invasion, this is a re-invasion, because Russia invaded Ukraine already in 2014 and took parts of the territory in this year. So if you take this systemic dimension of the global affairs, what I have been observing is a clear sign of Russia's repositioning in the long game. So basically by trying on the one side to place conditions for possible concessions to the Americans, and it was throughout these 2 months was only about talks with Biden and talks with the United States first and foremost, and not about the Europeans. But then again, given also this dragon bear approximation with China, there is, of course, a geopolitical window of opportunity, and Putin used it.
Now, Ukraine is fighting back. And Putin has said he has no intentions of occupying, although you can disagree with that, because he anticipates there'll be some kind of an insurgency or whatever. Do you think this is going to now spill over, or it's still early? It's still early in the game.
First, we should not take any statements by the Russian president at face value. Second, there is still this worst case scenario of occupation, full-scale invasion and occupation. It is possible, but I don't consider it being likely. Even now, under the circumstances of a full-scale military attack, I don't really consider this scenario of occupation of Ukraine for realistic. We are talking about a large European country with 42 million people, and it is beyond any reasonable sense that 190,000 Russian troops will actually enable an occupation of 42 million people in the long run. Now, when we talk about further intentions, as I said, since things are currently very fluid on the ground, the imminent goals of the military operation may change. We may even witness another worst case scenario, which would be a regime change, installing a puppet regime in Kiev, which will be loyal to Russia and the Russian interests. When we look at the whole region, the Eastern European region, well, in fact, Russia is already involved in all 6 countries in the region in one way or another. There have been frozen conflicts. These are conflicts with a low intensity, where from time to time things got escalated. Let me remind you that Russia has been involved in most of them. Either it has military presence, so-called peacekeeping troops in some of them, like in the case of Transnistria, which is near Moldova, or and of course is now also and is bordering Ukraine, and of course presents even bigger risk now, given that a full-scale military attack might further continue. But then we have also the situation with Belarus, and once again a completely different situation in the last several months, where meanwhile Russian troops remained on the ground following the Belarus-Russian military drills, and in fact have no intention of leaving the country, where there will be a constitutional referendum, and we might even witness a situation where Belarus will actually witness a completely new geopolitical situation of approximation with Russia. And then we have Georgia, once again, 2 republics which Russia actually helped secede from the country, permanently creeping borders of Georgia with Russia's help, now Ukraine. So in fact, and the last 2, of course, republics, Azerbaijan and Armenia, backed by Russia, there is military presence also in Azerbaijan following the war. You see that actually Russia is already there, and it has no intention of leaving.
So tell me, what would be the sentiment in Europe at this point? Given how nobody seems bothered.
Well, on an emotional level, of course, the outrage is absolutely undescribable. Of course, the member states, the European member states, are all supportive of Ukraine's position, with a few exceptions in Europe. And these exceptions, of course, are only at the level of certain political elites. There is zero understanding and zero acceptance for what Russia did to Ukraine. So in a sense, I think that a lot of the so-called Russia-friendly member states, because some of them were actually pursuing also rapprochements with Moscow, so geopolitical rapprochements, normalization of the relations. Just 2 years ago, France launched such rapprochement, such kind of approximation. Germany has been actually in a situation of geo-economic approximation for many years. The new gas pipeline was just about to be launched, the Nord Stream 2.0. Italy has very strong trade interests. But now, following these events, there is a clear shift in the mood. And even the political elites are right now siding 200% with the Ukrainian cause.
So how does this play out in the Indo-Pacific? One argument is that the US is now free to focus on the Indo-Pacific and China. How do you see this?
I agree with you, and I think this is, as I said, the long game. The long game is going to be played out in the Indo-Pacific, of course, with direct repercussions for Russia, for United States, for China, and increasingly for India. So I think that Russia is also trying to, as I said, upgrade on the one side, upgrade its positions in Europe. It wants to shape the fate of the European security architecture. It wants to actually create new rules of the game, but it also wants to close this chapter by determining the destiny of Ukraine. It is going to set an example for other states in Europe, what kind of retaliatory measures Moscow could introduce if Russian interests are at stake. But the Russian game is also increasingly turning to Eurasia. That means Central Asia, increasingly South Asia. And Moscow is also seeking for geopolitical corridors to get an access to the Indian Ocean. So in a sense, it is already sensing that, of course, the systemic rivalry between China and the United States is going to predominantly take place in the Indian Ocean, in the Indo-Pacific area, and also in East Asia. And of course, that is linked to the American retreat from the old continent I was pointing to in the long run. When exactly this is going to happen, we don't have a clear answer to this question. It may take another 10 years, it may take 20 years from now, but the objective systemic processes and trends point to this direction. And in this long game, Russia wants to play the role of a free rider. Russia thinks that neither United States nor China will be able to win a systemic competition against each other without Russia's participation. And at the same time, none of the two systemic rivals want to see Russia being part of the other's geopolitical bloc. It's a very complicated situation.
And would you presume that the pressure on India is going to mount from the Americans going forward?
Absolutely. I mean, India needs to, we have already observed, of course, a very careful diplomatic stance given the military escalation. The statement by India also at the first UN Security Council meeting. Russia is a long-term traditional and very stable strategic partner of India. India wants to see Russia playing more active role in the Indo-Pacific because of China. At the very same time, New Delhi is very worried about the dragon bear, about this modus vivendi of systemic coordination between Moscow and Beijing. And for India to remain non-aligned country, which is in the DNA, in the geopolitical DNA, is going to be increasingly difficult. So some tough decisions are going to be put on the table. How close this relationship with the United States will look like? Will it be a strategic alliance? There are already some trends pointing to this direction. India is part of the Quad. India is looking carefully at the AUKUS Security and Defense Pact. Japan is meanwhile also trying to be more active and, if possible, enter the AUKUS. And then, of course, it will be up to New Delhi to navigate through this very complex geopolitical context and environment. But one thing is very clear. All relevant players, and I consider India as being en route to become third world's economic power in this or probably in the next decade. So the role of India in the global order is going to change immensely. And I think, so I argue actually that all relevant geopolitical players will be confronted with either or choice at some point amid this bifurcation of the global system. So we are not in the situation of a multipolarity any longer. And as I said, the European security order and the international security order from the last 30 years period after the Cold War is, in my view, over. So we are now in a completely transitionary period of the international relations, and the way how the relevant powers are going to forge new alliances, partnerships, and are going to navigate this very insecure period is going to be very, very much decisive for their future and their place in the global order.
So last question, would you say India still has the luxury of choice, being able to move with the Americans sometimes, with the Russians at other times? Is that choice still there?
Absolutely. So I anticipate strategic approximation between United States and India, given the rapprochement between China and Pakistan, and also the unprecedented dragon bear rapprochement between Moscow and Beijing, which almost nobody has foreseen, and has been in the making for well, at least since 2014, following the previous military invasion of Ukraine. So this rapprochement, the dragon bear, is going to deepen. The economic dependence of Pakistan on China is going to deepen. And this, of course, close a lot of geo-economic space for India. And that would mean, of course, that India would need to be very creative. I would not exclude a normalization of trade and economic ties even with Pakistan, because Pakistan is increasingly being squeezed by China. Then again, as I said, I don't think that India would consider deteriorating relations with Moscow, because Moscow is rather neutral in the tensions between New Delhi and Beijing, and also can help facilitate diplomatic ties between these two Asian giants. And finally, as I said, there are a lot of important spheres of synergy between United States and India in the long run. Who is going to ride the fourth industrial revolution? India has a lot of leverage to offer to Washington, and Washington knows very well that it cannot win this competition with China on its own. It's going to need credible and serious partners. And here on the old continent, there is the big risk, from my view, that we are turning into something what I call a geopolitical backyard of the global affairs, continent that is no longer able to decide over its own fate.
So as I say, we live in interesting times. Velina Chakarova, pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for that perspective.
Thank you for the invitation.
And for all of you out there who are following this conversation, thank you for your observations. Keep following our programs as we go forward. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and do follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Thank you very much. Good night.
For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has been discussed threadbare through various aspects and through various angles. But the fallout of this conflict and the likely outcome of this conflict on the Indo-Pacific and the US-China relationship and the US-Russia relationship has perhaps not been discussed in as many details as we would like to do. And that's the topic of today's discussion on StratNews Global. And joining me in this special discussion is former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, joining me from Pune, a China specialist, as all of you know, and someone who watches geopolitics very closely and watches China much more closely than any other country. Welcome to this program, Vijay. And first up, let me ask you, what do you think and where do you think the Ukraine situation is going right now?
Yeah, thank you, Nitin. Thanks for having me on the show. I think the way in which the situation has developed in the war in Ukraine has surprised all the parties. Needless to say, Russia perhaps expected a quick victory, which hasn't happened. I think the Europeans and possibly even the Americans have been surprised at the strength of the Ukrainian resistance, symbolized in the person of President Zelensky. And I think the Chinese have been caught unawares by the breadth of the sanctions and the scope of the sanctions and the speed at which the sanctions have been imposed by the West. So I think that all the parties, whether directly involved in the Ukraine conflict or those who are watching it from the outside, are evaluating the implications of the war in Ukraine for their respective foreign policies and national security interests.
Right. In fact, if the Russians had expected a clean sweep much earlier, we are, I think, already in the 16th or 17th day of the war, and they still haven't been able to claim clear victory. But that apart, you mentioned very interestingly that the Chinese were surprised by the Russian move. Do you think when President Putin went to Beijing for the Winter Olympics, he would have briefed the Chinese on his possible approach to Ukraine? But did he keep it from them that he was launching the invasion? Or how do you think the Chinese must have been briefed about what was going to happen in Ukraine?
Nitin, that's a question to which there will be no definitive answer, except perhaps by President Putin and President Xi Jinping. But I suspect that a number of countries were aware of the possibility of conflict. And in their scenario planning, the Chinese, because they are a permanent member of the UN Security Council and a close partner of Russia, would have taken this into account. Nonetheless, I do believe in that school of thought which thinks that even if some indication may have been given by the Russian side to the Chinese side prior to the war in Ukraine, I doubt very much that the full details would have been shared with anybody.
So in that sense, I think the Chinese would feel a little let down because they have been close allies, close partners in that sense. So now, having seen this a fortnight-long conflict in Ukraine and the Russian moves, how do you think the Chinese are looking at the fallout on their relationship with the US and, of course, the relationship with the Russians?
Nitin, whatever one might say about feeling let down, countries don't decide their foreign and national security policies on that basis. If you look at the statement the Chinese foreign minister made on the 7th of March, and that was almost 10 or 12 days after the invasion began, he described the relationship between China and Russia as rock solid. He also said that the two countries will jointly oppose, and I want to particularly flag the word jointly, Both countries will jointly oppose attempts by the United States to revive the Cold War. He also indicated that Russia had legitimate security concerns and that any solution to be balanced and sustainable would have to take these into account. So all in all, despite whatever disappointment they may have felt, the Chinese have stood behind Russia, at least in the diplomatic sense. Now, from the Chinese perspective, I think there are two priorities. And both these, of course, will have geopolitical and geoeconomic implications outside Europe. The first, of course, is the Chinese are presumably very carefully studying what implications the sanctions will have on the Russian economy in order to identify the vulnerabilities and weaknesses in the Chinese economy with a view to hardening it so that future Western assaults of a similar nature cannot be mounted against China. Secondly, I think they will be watching to see how President Putin's government fares against these economic sanctions. I think it is their objective and a core part of their policy to ensure that President Putin does not suffer a setback and that there is no regime change in Russia as a result of the economic sanctions. Because to my mind, the current government of Russia is the best guarantor that Chinese can have for its own regime security. Any successor government which will be more accommodative to the West is likely to be less advantageous to the Chinese. And if there is one nightmare, if I can call it that the Chinese have, it is encirclement by Russia to its north and west and by the United States to its east. Therefore, it will take whatever steps it has to avoid that nightmare scenario from emerging.
Yes, in fact, interestingly, you said about the sanctions. I think the Chinese would be aware of the weaponization of various financial instruments, also the social media platforms. Of course, that doesn't affect the Chinese so much, but the financial instruments that they have. So when you say that, is it in a likely scenario of the Chinese moves against Taiwan, or generally if there is a larger Cold War 2.0, let's say, which will worry the Chinese that the West will go against them? Which scenario would you think are they looking at it from?
I think it has been clear for some time that China sees a sort of confrontation emerging between itself and the United States. Although it rarely refers to the United States by name, but if you see the press conference that the Chinese foreign minister held on the 7th of March, there were a number of references to a strong country that wants to protect its hegemony. And that's obviously the United States. Now, I presume, therefore, that China is planning for a scenario where something of a similar nature to what is happening to Russia's economy may be directed at the Chinese economy as well. And therefore, it is watching the unfolding of this conflict very, very carefully. The military lessons are, of course, important for China and indeed for every other country as well. But my sense is that the focus is not on the military lessons. It is on the economic and financial lessons of this Western tussle with Russia.
Indeed. In fact, there's an interesting term that Wang Yi used in that press conference, 5432, where he refers to all the alliances that are standing against China or are developing against China. India is part of that. I mean, India has abstained from the UN resolutions, like China has in many cases, balancing the foreign policy there. Obviously, there are military lessons even from India, for India, you would think, I would think. But for the Chinese, the economic lessons, like you said, are more important, I guess. But if you see, they're also not completely ruling out a talk or discussion with the United States. In fact, as we speak, I think the top US and Chinese leadership are going to meet in Rome today. So do you think the Chinese are keeping that option open of dialogue with the United States and make sure that they don't get completely out of the picture?
Yes, so I think they have two objectives. The first is to ensure that President Putin's government survives this crisis. And the second is to preserve that relationship with Russia without collateral damage to the Sino-US relationship. If that means that China needs to talk with the United States in order to work jointly with them to bring an end to this conflict, so that President Putin's government is not affected or is not weakened, then China will do so. And I think the discussions which will take place in Rome later today are perhaps the first step in that direction.
What about India's likely role? India is talking to both Ukraine and Russia and have reached out to both the presidents. Do you think India has a role to mediate or even to influence any of these decisions?
That's for the government to answer, Nitin. I can't. But
No, I know,
what
but-
I do want to say is that the conflict in Ukraine has geo-economic and geo-security implications for us that we should not ignore. Why do I say that? Because geo-economically, if we assume that one of China's principal objectives coming out of this conflict is to harden its economy from subsequent Western financial and economic assault, then one must presume that there will be a greater and not lesser decoupling in the economic and commercial fields. And decoupling per se for us is not a good development because it limits choices. It then becomes a binary choice where if we access one set of technologies or financial instruments or equipment, we are immediately closed out of the other set. So this has an implication for us which we need to be aware of. The second, of course, is the geostrategic or geosecurity implication.
Exactly.
China is going to ask Russia to support its vision of the Indo-Pacific if it supports Russia's vision of what NATO is doing in Eastern Europe. In other words, China backs Russia against NATO in Eastern Europe, and Russia in turn backs China against what it calls the American version of the Eastern NATO or the Indo-Pacific NATO. Now, this of course means a greater Sino-Russian combine against the idea of the Indo-Pacific. So whereas previously both Russia and China have spoken against the idea, the Russians have never dovetailed this with the Chinese idea. We can now expect that dovetailing and pushback to be coordinated, for them to work together on this. But I would go even further. I would say that we should therefore not only expect a full throttle pushback on the idea of the Indo-Pacific itself, but we should also expect a full throttle pushback on the idea of Quad.
Yes.
And what is noticeable, Nitin, is that the Chinese foreign minister has equated Quad with AUKUS and the Five Eyes.
Yes.
Completely unmindful of the fact that the Five Eyes and AUKUS are out and out military alliances or security alliances.
And Anglo-Saxon alliances.
Yes. Whereas Quad by no stretch of imagination is that. But this conflation of Quad with AUKUS, for instance, is a disturbing development we need to take note of because it complicates the geostrategic situation in our own region.
And the choices that India has get limited going forward. With who to align with, or at least the multi-alignment that India has been following for some time may come under a strain. And going forward, I think India will have to take a call at some places, perhaps, about the equipment that you mentioned, the military platforms, the military technology. So as we sort of wind up our discussion, one of the things that I wanted to ask you was also, how is Europe looking at all this? I mean, of course, NATO wanted to expand, and NATO has expanded over these last 30 years. What if the ceasefire is now put into effect, or some kind of a compromise that happens? How does Europe look at Russian move and the future Russian moves against Europe?
Yeah, and Nitin, before that, I just want to answer the previous question. I think India's foreign policy has been fairly successful in balancing the various interests. And I think we now begin to see the wisdom of the position that the government of India took in the multilateral forums when the conflict with Russia began. In that sense, we have rightfully expressed concern at the war, but we have also said that we have not, in a sense, been critical of Russia, and that relationship continues. So, in a sense, our multi-alignment policy may have come under a bit of pressure, but it is certainly still a very much a multi-aligned foreign policy. So I think that that's an important element.
It's good to know that. Yes, in fact, it's working, still working. I mean, it's a work in which is advantageous. It hasn't gone one way.
Just now, so far as Europe is concerned, I think what we must be prepared for is a diminution of European interest in the Indo-Pacific, at least in the short term. I have spoken to a number of European scholars as well as people who were formerly in government. All of them have told me that the impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine has taken them back to the German invasion of Poland. In other words, they see this as a World War II sort of point or inflection point. And therefore, their entire resources, their attention, their policies are all directed towards containing this so that it does not become a larger European war. In these circumstances, we need to ask ourselves how much of an appetite the Europeans will have to deploy not just their strategic or security resources in the Indo-Pacific, but even their economic resources. And secondly, given the skewed imbalance in where their existing resources are, since the vast majority of them are in China, it will also influence the way in which the Europeans deal with China and deal with the rest of the Indo-Pacific. So in a nutshell, I think, at least in the short term, we will have a challenge on our hands so far as trying to get Europeans to pay attention to the Indo-Pacific is concerned.
Yes, but I mean, so that means a change in policy, perhaps in the German approach towards Indo-Pacific, or the UK approach, which was recently becoming proactive as far as Indo-Pacific was concerned. That's what you are hinting at. But one final question about India-US relationship going forward. The US, does it understand India's compulsions in the kind of stand we have taken in the multilateral forums vis-a-vis this war? Or will the establishment in the US bring India under considerable pressure about decoupling from Russia or even China going forward?
Publicly, the Americans have said they understand India's position. I am given to understand that privately they are much more critical of the Indian position. This is not an unusual situation in which we find ourselves. I think we should be able to navigate out of this position. The fact is that our strategic partnership with the United States is a very important element in our foreign policy. Right. At the same time, there are certain important interests, I would even say core interests, in our relationship with Russia, and the concerns that we have about a dominant China in our region. If we are able to present all these in a balanced fashion, I think that there will be understanding. There may not be joy, but there will be understanding in Washington of our position.
That's well put, I think, Vijay. Thank you very much for your insights. And I think it's still unfolding. The war is not yet over. And we'll have to see how it pans out. But interesting positions and interesting balancing acts that all nations are doing right now. We will come back to you with more details and more questions when things settle down a bit. But for the moment, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Nitin.
So viewers, do keep watching StratNews Global. You know where to reach us. You've helped us reach 100,000 subscribers in these last 2 years. We thank you for that. But do tell your friends, family and colleagues about StratNews Global and ask them to subscribe to us. You will get different perspectives from this channel on various geostrategic and geoeconomic issues, as well as Indian interests in the strategic field. For the moment, it's goodbye.
For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to the Gist on StratNews Global. Hi, I'm Surya Gangadharan, and we are back to looking at the situation in Ukraine. Is it the endgame? That's the question we are asking this evening, because there are certain reports that suggest this may be the cessation of hostilities, although it's still early. But I have a small graphic here for you that I'd like you to look at. The report suggests that Russia and Ukraine are close to finalizing a 15-point peace plan. That's what we are reading. The peace plan includes a ceasefire and withdrawal of Russian forces. The reports say its success would be contingent on Ukraine declaring neutrality. And Ukraine will also not seek to join NATO or host foreign military bases. Now, these are reports that we are getting. This is actually substantially the Russian position, and I presume that we'll have more on that from our guest, whom I'd like to welcome. Christina Spohr. She's a professor of international relations at the London School of Economics. She's also a senior fellow at the Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins. Christina Spohr, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me.
So you've seen the graphic that we've just that I just played. Is it your sense that this is somewhere close to an end game? Is this just the position that the Russians have articulated? The Ukrainians have something else in mind?
I think we are not yet close to an end game. I mean, we have had several rounds now of talks. And yesterday, indeed, in the Financial Times, we heard a bit about the Russian position of the Russian demands, a 15-point plan, whereas Ukrainians, of course, said these are their draft demands, and Ukraine has its own position. And what, of course, is very interesting here is that clearly, as you are in this crisis where one side has gone in with the maximal position and undertaken an aggression and gone to war, from that position as well as a question of if you want to come somehow to a peace, you have to find avenues to get out of it. So this is where we are with these talks. And like with all ceasefire initiatives, of course, even if there were a ceasefire, it often takes a very long time and they can be broken until you actually get to a peace. So let's just think a little bit about some of these points that have been made. So, of course, there is the demand for Ukrainian neutrality, for declaring that they will never seek to join NATO. And of course, that should also lead to a constitutional change in the Ukrainian constitution with the offer of potentially withdrawing the Russian troops from Ukrainian soil. But we have to also remember how, we got into this war. It was about demilitarization, denazification. Yeah. Those were the sort of terms used. And of course, we have to also think what are the treaties that Russia had signed up to: the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, then consolidated through the OSCE, the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, where there is enshrined the principle of sovereignty, the principle of inviolability of borders, and of course, importantly also, the free right of every nation to choose its alliances. So, to demand constitutional changes and, to ask basically for a denuding of the state is actually even worse than, of course, what we saw with Austria and with Finland after the Second World War. If we consider sort of previous situation where under Russian pressure, countries had to act in particular ways. And the right also to purchase your weaponry freely from whoever you like. Is of course also one of the freedoms that is in treaties that Russia itself signed. And I think this is of course where negotiations will be very tough, because if you go against those treaties of which Russia is also a signatory, never mind the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, where Ukraine, which held 1/3 of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, when it gave those up, when it joined the Non-Proliferation Treaty and security guarantees were offered by Britain, America, and Russia, for the integrity of the state, then of course, this really questions the whole post-war, post-1991 European order based on these principles that everybody signed up to in order to preserve the peace on the continent despite different interests. And I think one final point that's really important in this whole debate is also this aspect that, of course, these Central and Eastern European states, the ex-satellite states in the Warsaw Pact, even former Soviet republics, even countries that had been annexed into the Soviet Union, such as the Baltic states, they chose to approach NATO and EU, but in particular also NATO for security guarantees. So here you see this continuation, if you so wish, of America as an empire by invitation. Whereas what you are seeing with Russia now is actually like with the Soviet Union. It's an empire by imposition. It wants to enforce what it believes belongs to itself. And I think that has to be very clearly stated. This is all part of the Russian narrative of gathering historic Russian lands and not accepting that there's different nations. And in the meantime, since 1991, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, states that through referenda gained independence, which Russia in 1992 recognized.
But we do have reports about the Ukrainian president indicating that perhaps Ukraine will not join NATO, that it's unrealistic, that perhaps, there should be some kind of neutrality. These reports have appeared.
Absolutely. And I mean, look at it from the Ukrainian perspective. Now is not an opportune moment to even discuss joining NATO. I mean, this is would be such a provocative move. And of course, even to join NATO, even if when you make an application and then were you to be given a membership action plan with criteria to fulfill, of course, already in 2008, 2009, when this was on the cards, when Georgia and Ukraine pressed a little more, actually NATO did not issue those invitations because they also didn't think those countries were ready for it. It's actually the same problem if you also consider, EU membership. The EU has made very clear, it's a very high hurdle of standards you have to fulfill to become an EU member, socially, politically, economically, in terms of security policy. So actually, in some ways, you could argue that, for the Ukraine now to even consider this, it's completely not on the cards because NATO would not even consider making such an offer. In fact, the war has made it also from the Ukrainian perspective and from NATO's perspective inconceivable to consider these kind of options. And that's where you see, of course, a difference for Finland and Sweden. They are of the level, they are interoperable, they're very, very close anyway, and they have to consider the pros and cons, whether it's worthwhile or not to consider a potential NATO membership, considering they are an EU member.
At this point, Professor, when it appears that the Russian advance appears to have lost steam, that's the reports we are reading.
Yes.
But Ukraine continues to be shelled. There's an exodus of civilians. Would you say the pressure is more on whom? On the Russians or on the Ukrainians?
I mean, the pressure's on the Ukrainians simply because there's an invasion of their country, and it's by a huge neighbor with a huge military, mass troops that can be brought in, and of course a country with the most nuclear weapons. In terms of the threat and the power behind it, Russia can continue this for a very long time, especially if it keeps its own population under control and they're happy to go along with it and there's no uprising. However, you see, of course, that, the Ukraine, not just in terms of morale, but also operationally has been able to really defend very hard key cities, in particular also Kiev. And yes, you see in every war, when you start a war, also from the war starter, it's a risk. And we see, Russia has logistical problems. Russia will need to bring, petrol to its trucks and to its tanks. Russia will have to get new troops. They've also lost thousands of troops, apparently. I mean, nobody has certain figures, but losses have been on both sides. And, after 3-4 weeks of war, there's always the need for replenishment, for re-strengthening. And that's why also with these supposed ceasefire talks, we have to consider, is here somebody buying time so that they can actually replenish? That, of course, gives also defensive side also time to regather. But there's always a sort of natural up and down when the waves of war take place. And of course, you also have to consider, even were there to be some kind of pullback eventually, If it is about controlling Ukraine, we now know and we can see that there will be a long insurgency, that Ukrainians will not put up with this. And so this is not something that, if it was initially conceived as a quick, clean 1-week war, this has completely backfired. That is probably the biggest miscalculation on the Russian side, considering that they, of course, come with all their big mass into this action that they have planned for a very long time. Clearly, we saw this, with the arms buildup. This was planned for a very long time.
Now, is it conceivable that the Russians have, you said miscalculated? You mean to say the Russians, after having spent so much time, I mean, they know the Ukrainians, these are their own blood. They've said that. And they could have gone so wrong militarily in terms of their campaign?
Well,
or are they playing for time through negotiation? Is that what it is?
This is fraternal warfare between two Slavic countries, of course, and nations. Many people, most people probably have relatives on both sides. Yeah. That's why it is so horrible. But of course, as you know from Putin's speeches, he more and more got obsessed with the idea that Ukraine is a nothing, that Ukraine is actually the heart of Russia, that they haven't got a right to exist on their own. He somehow completely misjudged that this country that has been an independent country for 30 years has its own identity. It uses its own language, that even Russians who live in Ukraine still feel that they want to fight for this Ukraine, for that type of country they're living in. Otherwise, they could have gone back to Russia over the last 30 years if it wasn't to their liking. And I think, if you consider this, how a despot works, how they sit in the Kremlin, how they only have around themselves advisors who say what they want to hear, you start living in a kind of bubble. And that was perhaps reinforced through the COVID, when people were in any case more isolated and Putin was more isolated. So it becomes like an echo chamber. And when you put on top of that a sort of 20-year building of narrative, as regards to Ukraine, but also as regards to, Russia, Russian values, make Russia great again, reversing the way the world order was going, saying, I don't like this unipolarity. I want American recognition for multipolarity. We want a post-West world order, Lavrov said in 2019, having the slightly unholy alliance with the Chinese, which is uneasy also for the Russians. It's a huge country on their southern border that is also not, a very happy situation. And of course, at the same time, Russia orients always to the West. It's also the capitals are in Europe. The competitor is America. The competitor is a West that has growth, that has certain freedoms, that has a type of governance, and that's been attractive. And what's probably most vexing for Putin is that Russia's near abroad, in other words, the ex-republics, plus the satellite states, have chosen not Russia for security guarantees or for close alignment, but have chosen to turn to the West. And that, of course, links up with the saying, the biggest geopolitical catastrophe for Russia was the collapse of the Soviet Union. He doesn't say World War I or II, which for most Europeans would be the biggest catastrophes. For him, it's the collapse of that Soviet empire.
So what would be a breaking point for Putin? At the point at which he decides that this can't continue and I have to stop this. Is there a breaking point?
I think at the moment we are seeing something very interesting. Last night he gave a speech where it's all about, cleaning Russian society. I mean, the language, for me, as a half German, I'm German Finnish. There's language that reminds us of Germany in the 1930s and 40s. Cleaning out the society. Anybody who is sort of Western-oriented Russian, has to be punished for their thoughts. So there's, this. That's almost also Stalinesque. How you control. Not just through censorship and by sending people to jail, but also by the narratives you put out there. You control the story that you're putting out there. But, there comes a question. Putin went in with sort of maximal positioning. That's why he's different from Stalin going into Finland in the Winter War in 1939. The question is Putin, willing to go a step back from, say, in the Ukraine with a more minimal position and then see what else he can do. But in some ways, of course, through the sanctions regime, what he has brought onto his own country is not just destroying the Ukraine. I mean, in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks, how many cities have already been effectively razed to the ground? Because all the damaged buildings have to be taken down anyway. They're not livable. That's dangerous. So, that destruction, the cultural destruction, but also the destruction for his own vast Eurasian empire. How, how the Russians have to live, ordinary Russians under that sanctions regime, and how they're cut off from the world. And that's huge damage for long. It has thrown Russia back at least 30 years, I think. So, it's for him, he's pushing actually himself into the corner, not just in terms of the military campaign, but also, of course, how it looks for him as a leader in a country who has to somehow keep the people on board, also in his closest entourage of the advisors. I mean, look, even Igor Ivanov, a more hardline foreign minister from 20 years ago, has come out and said, this war was a very, very bad idea on the side of Russia, and it has made Russia into a pariah state. It has broken the one thing. It is, the UN security, the UN Charter. Russia is a member of the UN Security Council. Who is not on the UN Security Council? Germany and Japan as culprits of World War II. Now Russia, a member on that council, has, been the aggressor and is destroying the possibility for any resolutions where the world community could come together on paragraphs and articles and principles and norms they have all signed up to. So we are seeing actually the 19th century behavior that, power trumps principles. And that is something which, tells us that what has been, even in the Cold War context, we had tried to have some kind of principle framework, some kind of fora. That's been completely undermined because one of the biggest powers in the world and the biggest nuclear power in the world has now destroyed belief in those treaties, has ripped up effectively those agreements. And of course, in order to function, we need, even when we are in different positions, even when we have different national interests, to somehow be able to cooperate, we need to have avenues, we need to have some fudged principles and compromises that we at least can talk some kind of common language, even if we defend different interests. And that is so problematic about this war. Sorry.
Do you believe Putin's support base? You were talking about the Russian people. I mean, I presume the people may not matter very much, but the military political establishment that is behind him. Do you see any cracks, any fissures there?
Well, you see, that's why I think it's interesting that, like I said, the former foreign minister, who wasn't exactly like Andrei Kozyrev in the early 90s, a sort of very reformist type, that actually somebody who's more on the national conservative side has come out and said, this war of aggression is simply wrong. So you can see that there's clearly unease, but there's so many levels of course, that security apparatus, the KGB, the militia, the police, the army, the navy, there's all these different kinds of layers, which are all at the moment used also to keep the own country under control as much as trying, in this mission to gather those historic lands. So we have to see also how from within the apparatus, how long people are willing to go along with it when it has so much repercussions also on the domestic situation for Russia at home, as much as for Russia's position in the world. And we can see, even with China, it's been uneasy. They haven't yet exactly positioned themselves on one or the other side. They're also hedging their bets.
Yeah. Do you think that, these cracks and the fact that the former senior official in the Russian government has come out against Putin, would you hazard a guess as to whether this disquiet has spread to the military? Because we keep seeing largely Western reports that the campaign has lost steam. They're having a lot of logistical issues. There are questions being raised elsewhere. What is the truth to these reports?
Well, I think, you also have to think how many conscripts have been drawn into this war. To conduct a war with conscripts, what is these people, what is their morale to go into a war when they were thinking they were taking part in some maneuvers? These kids are 17, 18, 19 years old. They're the Twitter generation. They're not, the generation of World War I or World War II. What's the purpose here? They want to have a life. Now they're leaving their lives behind on the battlefield. So, I think on those levels, that, also when, the mothers and the fathers find out that their sons are now stuck in somewhere where they had no idea that their children were going, and they were used effectively as cannon fodder, because that's what we are seeing with this machinery. You see, that's where the Ukrainian side is very interesting. They have been differently trained. They conduct special operations. They work in small group, rapid reaction, these kinds of things. Whereas Russia is using that old style, full on the go, mass military campaign. But as I said, it's at different levels. We don't even know really, which are the people beyond Shoigu and Lavrov and a couple of others who actually have his ear, who actually can get close, because so far from the highest level down in the security apparatus, he's holding a tight grip. But in the end, we all know from history, sometimes it only takes one or two people at the very top who, stage a coup or eliminate the person. I mean, there's many things that can happen at the very top. There's also the question, remember, 1917 revolution, it all began with bread. When there's nothing in a Russian fridge, that trumps television. So, if their people have nothing to eat, there will come a moment, surely, when also in a massive way, the Russian population would say, we cannot carry on like this for our own sake, irrespective of what's going on in the Ukraine. What does it matter to a person in Kamchatka or Novosibirsk what's happened in the Ukraine? Beyond, of course, they are Russian patriots. Of course, they are proud for their culture. But all of this is getting tainted because of this war of aggression. And it doesn't anymore work in relation to talk about the Great Patriotic War when the Germans invaded them. Of course. And for that, you have had decades of reconciliation. And the German chancellor said that, he doesn't want the reconciliation of, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years that's been going on between the populations at all levels to be destroyed, because actually now the governments, of course, are at loggerheads because they stand on different positions here.
So I'm going to ask you to speculate a bit. We are now in the third week of the campaign. Going forward, say, of the week, 10 days, what's your sense of which way things could go? This is very speculative, but...
Yeah, and as you know, I'm a historian, not a futurologist. But, let me just say, and I said this actually in the very beginning when I was writing a few blogs, how we had gotten where we were and what the problem was in the longer term structurally for the international community. This war isn't going to end tomorrow or in 1 week. There will be at least some simmering, even if they come to some kinds of agreements. There's always some misfirings. Pulling back is difficult. This fighting, we will still be in this war in a week's time. We might see a little bit of a lulling simply because I said the history tells us, whether you look at the Vietnam War or other wars, that after a few weeks, each side needs to regather, needs to reconsider tactics, strategies, how you're going. You have one side that is defending tooth and nail their country, their nation, their way of life, their way they want to be governed. And there's another country that has various ambitions expressed in different ways as regards to the territory, certain segments of the territory, and what they want to achieve. The question is, will there be any kind of coming together, that the talks continue, that over time you will begin to move out of this conflictual situation? But at the moment, even if you think, yesterday there was talk about talks and perhaps there is a first draft from the Russian side being put forward. Look where we are 12, 24 hours later. We are still seeing bombardments. We are seeing exactly the same as we saw yesterday. And I think that next week we will still be, in this horrible warfare with more refugees on the one hand pouring out, with more people fighting to the death to defend their country, and with the Russians trying to pocket in especially on the eastern and northern side, and still trying to press to Kiev.
So last question, you mentioned the word coup a little while ago. A coup, I presume, would come from the military, and if that does happen, what are we looking at? I mean, Russia then changes, Europe changes. I mean, what happens?
I really cannot speculate what kind of government would emerge in Russia. And it all depends also how then Russia will... I mean, every war ends at some point. And a lot will depend on in which way that exit from that war, which will be a long process. If you look at other wars and the exits, they take months, they take years. Then we will have to look at where we are at the end of that process, and how then you build some channels of dialogue, and what is your starting point as regards to also, these foundational treaties I talked about. You will have to rewrite quite a lot and consider how is, the institutional West. And by that, I don't mean like geographically, but the countries that sign up to particular types of governance and values and norms and principles. And that includes, for example, Japan as part of the G7, how everybody is relating after the war to Russia, wherever its boundaries may then be. And, there's still lots of open question marks. for Russia versus, maybe Estonia, that NATO border, Russia and Finland. There will be a lot in Europe. You have to see how realignments take place and where the final, if you so wish, borders between Russia and what Russia sees as its direct sphere of influence will be, and the borders of that institutional West. Because you see, Belarus is also effectively at the moment, full of Russian soldiers. And if you look at the map, Putin would get exactly what he didn't want, namely a hard border between where the NATO eastern flank is and where the Russian influence sphere is. Whereas previously, you had a whole bunch of countries that were sort of in between, more Russia-leaning or more Western-leaning. And, that had given us a certain amount of stability.
So if that ends, then we are again going back to the Cold War? Is that what you're hinting at?
No, we are not going back to the Cold War. The Cold War was in some ways relatively stable. It was a competition between two superpower-led parts of the world, and had the nuclear power, the mutual assured destruction. But of course, now we have more nuclear powers. We have that particular system has definitely moved to something more multipolar. And remember, China has said it wants to be a world-leading power by 2050. That development will continue. Russia has tried to reverse course, but of course now it has thrown itself also economically back enormously. And we have to see how the Euro-Atlantic area, the non-aligned areas, China, Russia, how that will sort of balance itself out, and where will be, possibilities to somehow start dialogue and cooperate. And, it also affects even the open market, the world market. I mean, at the moment, Russia is completely isolated. And if you look at the map, you just see the biggest country in the world has turned itself into a pariah state.
Fascinating. Christina Spohr, wonderful talking to you. Thank you very much for that insight. And looking forward to seeing where this endgame actually plays out and how it plays out.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And yes, let's see. We are all observers. Thank you.
Pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And for those of you who have joined us on this conversation, thank you for your comments and observations. Follow us on our YouTube channel, subscribe to it. Follow us on Twitter and other social media. Thank you. Good night.
This is StratNews Global. You're watching Talking Point. I'm Amitabh Brevi, and today we're discussing the situation in and around Ukraine, the Quad meeting, and India's interests.